This story does not begin with explosions. It begins with calm. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor looked peaceful. The water barely moved. The ships were anchored in neat rows. Men followed routines they trusted, because routine feels like safety. Breakfast, small talk, letters from home. But the turning point was not in the harbor. It was somewhere else, behind closed doors, with maps, papers, and quiet voices deciding what would happen next. By the time the sun reached the deck, the most important choice had already been made. No alarms, no warnings. Just the illusion that tomorrow would look exactly like yesterday. And that is why Pearl Harbor was not just an attack. It was the moment the last alternatives disappeared. The calm you see here was real, but it was already outdated. Somewhere across the ocean, men were already committed to a path they could not reverse. And in that thin space between calm and catastrophe, the world was about to change forever. Pearl Harbor was not a random surprise. It was the result of pressure building for years. By 1941, Japan was expanding across Asia. But expansion depends on one thing: oil. Japan imported most of its oil, and the United States was the main supplier. When restrictions tightened and oil shipments stopped, Japan faced a deadline. Without fuel, the Navy could not operate. And without the Navy, Japan could not hold its empire. So the choice became brutal. Accept the pressure and pull back. Or strike first and try to seize resources elsewhere. That is why the Pacific mattered. And that is why Pearl Harbor mattered. Pearl Harbor was a major naval base. Damaging it could slow the American response long enough for Japan to move in Southeast Asia. While sailors in Hawaii followed routine, planners worked with maps and distances. They measured routes. They counted ships. They counted time. Then the plan moved from paper to action. Units were assigned. Routes were locked. Radio silence was enforced. And once the ships started moving, everything changed. At that point, it was no longer a debate. It was a countdown. The strike force did not sail toward Hawaii by accident. It sailed under strict radio silence across thousands of miles of open ocean. No signals, no lights, just discipline, timing, and distance. Because if the Americans detected the fleet early, the entire operation collapsed. So the plan depended on one thing: staying invisible until the final hours. And while those ships moved closer, Pearl Harbor stayed asleep. Not because anyone was careless, but because no one believed an attack could arrive that fast. Confidential. That meant one thing. This was no longer a discussion. No more theories, no more assumptions. The order had already been given and signed. By early December, the operation was already moving. Not on paper, on the ocean. Japan's strike force traveled thousands of miles under strict radio silence. No signals, no lights, no mistakes. Because one early detection could collapse the entire plan. That silence mattered. It reduced the chance of interception. It reduced the chance of warning. And it kept the United States guessing. On the American side, the picture still looked incomplete. There were warnings and reports, but they did not point to one clear answer. Most commanders expected the first strike in Southeast Asia, not in Hawaii. That expectation shaped everything. It shaped where attention went. It shaped what was treated as a threat and what was treated as noise. At Pearl Harbor, the atmosphere stayed routine. Ships remained clustered in the harbor. Aircraft were parked in predictable rows. It was efficient, it was organized, and it was vulnerable. Even the strongest defenses fail when they are aimed in the wrong direction. Because preparation is not just about having information. It is about recognizing what the information means. Meanwhile, the strike force kept moving. Hour by hour, it closed the distance. And with every mile, the chance to stop it became smaller. This is the real turning point. Not the moment the first bomb fell, but the moment both sides committed. One side committed to the strike, the other committed to the belief that it would not happen here. And once those two decisions existed at the same time, the outcome became inevitable. And then, the countdown ended. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave hit. In minutes, Pearl Harbor stopped being a naval base and became a trap. Ships were packed close together. Crews were not at full readiness, and the attack was designed to exploit speed, confusion, and surprise. This was not random destruction. It was a plan with priorities. Airfields first, because if American aircraft got into the air, the operation could fail. Battleships next, because battleships were the visible symbol of American power in the Pacific. Then communications and command, anything that could organize an immediate response. On the ground, aircraft were lined up in predictable rows. That arrangement was meant to prevent sabotage, but it also meant a single pass could destroy dozens of planes before they could move. In the harbor, men woke up to noise they could not explain fast enough. Some thought it was training. Some thought it was an accident, until the pattern became obvious. Bombs fell with purpose. Torpedoes ran low through shallow water. Smoke climbed into the sky, and within the first hour, the morning turned into damage control. But this story is not only about what happened in the harbor. It is about the order behind it. The decision to strike Pearl Harbor as the opening move of war came from the highest level of the Japanese Empire. Formally, it was sanctioned by Emperor Hirohito, and it was agreed inside Japan's government and military leadership through an imperial conference. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto pushed the plan forward. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led the strike force, and the reason was brutally practical. Japan needed oil. It needed resources it could no longer freely import, and it needed control of Southeast Asia to keep the empire alive. Pearl Harbor was not meant to win the war in one morning. It was meant to buy time. Time to seize territory, time to secure fuel, time to build a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. And for a moment, it worked. Its battleships were damaged or sunk. Airfields were hit. Command was disrupted. And the United States was forced to react inside chaos. But the operation had limits. And those limits mattered more than the initial shock. The American aircraft carriers were not in the harbor. They were at sea. That single detail mattered for the future of the war, because the Pacific would be decided by carriers, aircraft, and logistics, not by battleships sitting in a harbor. Pearl Harbor also did not erase the base itself. Fuel storage was not completely destroyed. Repair capabilities survived. Docks, workshops, and logistics remained functional enough to recover. So the attack did not remove American power in the Pacific. It forced it to adapt, and it forced it to choose. After Pearl Harbor, the United States did not have space for hesitation. The debate ended. The country unified, and the response shifted from pressure to full mobilization. On December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan, and in that moment, Pearl Harbor stopped being just an attack. It became a trigger, because once the United States entered the war, the conflict changed scale overnight. Factories shifted, production surged, shipbuilding accelerated, air power became central. Pearl Harbor was supposed to buy Japan time. Instead, it activated the one outcome Japan could not afford: a united United States, mobilized for total war. And once that machine started moving, it did not stop. The second wave pulled away and the sky slowly emptied, but the danger did not leave with it. Pearl Harbor had been built to shock the United States into hesitation. Instead, it forced the opposite. In the hours after the attack, the question stopped being what had been hit. It became what had survived, and what that survival made possible. The carriers were not in the harbor. That single fact meant the Pacific Fleet still had a mobile striking force. and Japan had not erased the base itself. Fuel storage was not fully destroyed. Dry docks and repair shops remained usable. The harbor kept working. Salvage teams started lifting wrecks while smoke was still visible in the distance. The attack had produced damage, but not a knockout. That is why the turning point is not only the bombing, it is the order behind it, and the response it made unavoidable. The decision to strike Pearl Harbor as the opening move of war came from the highest level of the Japanese Empire. Formally, Emperor Hirohito sanctioned it. Japan's government and military leadership agreed through an imperial conference. Once that decision was locked in, the Navy's role was execution. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto pushed the plan forward because he understood Japan's deadline. Oil. Without it, the empire could not operate. When access to fuel tightened and the pressure increased, Japan faced a brutal choice. Accept limits and pull back, or strike first and seize resources elsewhere. Pearl Harbor was designed to buy the time needed to move into Southeast Asia and secure those resources. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led the carrier strike force that carried the order across the ocean. But the moment the order succeeded tactically, it failed strategically in a different way. It erased uncertainty inside the United States. On December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan. That decision did not simply add another country to the fighting. It changed the scale of the entire conflict. A divided America became a mobilized America. A hesitant America became an industrial America. A regional war became a global war with an economy behind it. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and America answered. The Pacific Strike had connected fronts. The war in Europe and the war in Asia were no longer separate storms. They became one system, pulling in production, shipping, intelligence, and strategy across the world. Japan did gain time in the short term. It surged through Southeast Asia, targeting the resources it needed. Bases fell. Routes changed. For a moment, the timetable that Pearl Harbor was meant to create looked real. But timetables only matter if you can hold what you take. Holding requires supply. Supply requires ships, fuel, and air cover. And now Japan was fighting an enemy that could expand those things faster than Japan could replace them. This is where the story becomes concrete. Pearl Harbor taught both sides that the Pacific would not be decided by battleships in neat rows. It would be decided by carriers, aircraft, and logistics. The missing American carriers were not a side detail. They were the future. In early 1942, the United States was not ready to dominate. It was ready to learn. It absorbed shocks, protected convoys, reorganized command, and started building. The first counterblows were not about winning the war. They were about proving the United States could hit back and forcing Japan to guard more space than it wanted. Then the carrier war began to show its logic. The first major check on Japan's momentum came at Coral Sea, where neither side's ships even saw each other directly. Aircraft decided the outcome. Japan was slowed. The perimeter was tested. And the Pacific War revealed its new rule. Distance could be deadly, and carriers were the center of gravity. A month later came Midway, the moment that exposed how fragile Japan's advantage really was. And Midway is where that logic finally becomes visible. Midway was not only a battle of planes, it was a battle of information and timing. American code-breaking helped reveal where Japan would strike. Japan moved with confidence, expecting to eliminate American carriers the way it had damaged battleships. But the United States reached the fight with a different kind of preparation. Not perfect strength, but better focus. When Japan lost carriers at Midway, it lost more than steel. It lost experienced air crews it could not replace quickly. It lost initiative. It lost the ability to dictate tempo. From that point forward, Japan was no longer expanding into the future. It was defending a perimeter that would only shrink. That shift is the long shadow of Pearl Harbor. The order that began the war on Japan's terms created a conflict where Japan could not afford the long term. After Midway, the war turned into pressure, one island and one supply line at a time. Guadalcanal showed how brutal that pressure would be. It was a fight for an airfield, for control of a single point that could reshape shipping routes. It was also a lesson. Logistics wins or breaks armies. Men fought, ships burned, and aircraft fell. But what decided the campaign was whether each side could keep supplying the fight. The United States could scale that supply. Japan struggled to do the same across longer, riskier routes. From there, the pattern hardened into strategy. The United States began pushing forward through island chains, not to take land for its own sake, but to build runways, shorten supply lines, and bring air power closer. Each new base made the next move cheaper and faster. Each step forward turned the ocean into a narrower space for Japan to survive in. Japan's answer was determination and defense. But defense without replacement becomes attrition, and attrition is arithmetic. Pearl Harbor had made that arithmetic unavoidable. Once America mobilized, it could replace ships, aircraft, pilots, and fuel at a scale Japan could not match. Japan could still win battles. It could still inflict losses. But it could not stop the machine from growing. This is why the consequences of the order reach beyond the Pacific. For Britain, American entry meant the Atlantic lifeline had a stronger protector, and that industrial output would rise instead of collapse under strain. For the Soviet Union, it meant Germany now faced a world war that could not be contained on the Eastern Front alone, because the United States would supply, pressure, and eventually open new fronts. For the global balance of power, it meant the center of gravity was shifting toward nations that could produce, ship, and coordinate at scale. And for Japan itself, the order carried a final trap. Pearl Harbor was meant to shock America into stepping back. Instead, it made American resolve non-negotiable. It removed alternatives. It closed diplomatic doors. It turned an argument into a unified direction. That is what signed decisions do. They do not just start actions. They end options. Formally, it began at the top. The Imperial Conference decision, sanctioned under Emperor Hirohito. Operationally, it moved through Yamamoto's planning and Nagumo's execution. Politically, it detonated in Washington with a declaration of war that set the United States on a path toward total mobilization. Strategically, it changed the Pacific into a carrier and logistics war that punished the side that could not replace losses. When you look back from the end of the conflict, the harbor itself becomes only the first page. The real story is the chain reaction. One order across an ocean, one response that unified an industrial superpower, and one global war that expanded until the old world order could not survive it. Pearl Harbor is remembered for fire and smoke, but its true power was quieter. It was the moment a decision removed the last alternatives. And when the alternatives disappear, history does not drift. It accelerates. In the months immediately after the attack, the Pacific did not feel like a production race yet. It felt like collapse. The Philippines were struck. American and Filipino forces fought while supply lines broke. The fall of the islands and the retreat into Bataan were not just battlefield losses. They were proof of what Japan had wanted to achieve: speed, shock, and a perimeter that looked too wide to challenge. But the United States did challenge it, because the order at Pearl Harbor had made challenge the only acceptable answer. Washington reshaped command and strategy fast. Leaders were replaced. New commanders were elevated. Admiral Chester Nimitz took command in the Pacific and began turning survival into plan. Decisions that had been debated in peacetime became orders in wartime. Prioritize carriers, protect logistics, build forward bases, and force Japan to spend resources defending distance. Japan, meanwhile, tried to turn early victories into a new status quo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government committed fully to expansion, believing a defensive perimeter and resource control could outlast American will. But will is not measured in speeches. It is measured in what a country keeps doing when the cost rises. That is why the first American counterstroke mattered even when it changed little on the map. The Doolittle raid did not destroy Japan's industry. It did something else. It proved the homeland could be reached. It created pressure inside Japanese leadership to extend the perimeter farther outward, to prevent future raids. And pressure creates mistakes, because expanding a perimeter also expands the supply problem. That pressure fed directly into Midway. Japan aimed to lure and destroy the American carriers that had survived Pearl Harbor. The plan was ambitious, but ambition in a carrier war is punished by timing and information. Midway did not win the Pacific for the United States in one day. It did something more important. It removed Japan's ability to treat the war as a controlled schedule. After Midway, Japan's navy was still dangerous, but it was no longer positioned to dictate the next chapter. From there, the war became a sequence of hard decisions for both sides. For Japan, the choice was where to defend and where to concede, because it could not defend everything. For the United States, the choice was how to advance without paying the highest possible cost at every step. That is why island hopping became strategy rather than slogan. Bypass strong points, isolate them, and move the airfields and supply lines forward. Every captured island became a runway. Every runway became pressure. Every step forward shortened American logistics and stretched Japan's. The names of battles changed, but the logic did not. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Each campaign was a test of supply and replacement. Each loss Japan took cost more than equipment. It cost trained crews, pilots, and experience that could not be rebuilt quickly. When the United States reached the Marianas, the war entered another phase. American bombers could reach deeper targets. The ocean was no longer a moat protecting the homeland. It was a corridor the United States was learning to control. Japan still fought, still adapted, still inflicted damage. But its choices narrowed. And then came the moment that made the chain of consequences impossible to deny. Leyte Gulf, in 1944, was not a single battle as much as a collapse of Japan's ability to contest the sea at scale. It was a fight across multiple engagements, shaped by the same truth that Pearl Harbor had unleashed. The side that cannot replace losses will eventually lose the ability to act, no matter how brave the defense becomes. As the war closed in, the cost rose for everyone. Okinawa showed what the final approach would look like. Intense air and naval combat, devastating casualties, and a conflict that no longer had room for halfway measures. By that stage, the consequences of the original order were fully visible. Japan had secured resources only briefly. It had gained time only briefly. The perimeter had not created safety. It had created obligations, more routes to defend, more fuel to burn, more ships to risk. The United States, on the other hand, had turned shock into system. It had turned anger into output. It had turned a surprise attack into a long-term advantage by refusing to treat the war as a single event. That is why Pearl Harbor is not only remembered as a tragedy, it is studied as a decision. The Imperial Conference decision, sanctioned under Emperor Hirohito, was meant to start the war on Japan's terms. Yamamoto's plan and Nagumo's execution were meant to buy the empire enough time to secure a future. The result was the opposite. The order triggered a response that transformed the war into a contest Japan could not outproduce and could not outlast. And the world that emerged afterward was different because of that chain reaction. The United States became a permanent Pacific power. Japan was rebuilt into a new role in a new order. Alliances hardened. Military doctrine changed. Carriers, aviation, intelligence, and logistics became the center of modern war planning. Pearl Harbor did not change history because it was loud. It changed history because it was final. It ended alternatives, forced commitments, and turned a regional conflict into a global machine that could not be stopped once it began. If you want more turning point stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because the next decision that changed history might be closer than you think.